Hello everyone. Hello. Can you hear me from online and from the theater? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Cool. Great. Perfect. Okay, great. So let's get started. So what are we going to talk about today? So we are now in week 8. So week 8, we are mainly focusing on requirements. So our explanation about iterations rate has already been given to you as a pre-recorded video in your iterations rate spec. So you should be able to find that video there. But please be mindful that there are some changes from previous year. So refer to the spec. Okay, cool. Otherwise, we'll be focusing on requirements. So why is this important? Why should we learn about requirement engineering or the process of requirements? So I've been looking on LinkedIn about jobs like posted about like when they are asking about experience or knowledge on requirement engineering, and I found that it's very popular asking about for example, this one. It's a job from EY, and the job is a technical business analyst. And they are asking, for example, here, what we are looking for. So what they are looking for. So they are looking for somebody who can create requirement specifications, analyzing requirement, etc. And both technical and technical stakeholders requirements from them. Yeah, and also found some others, for example, this one, the technology consultant. They are well-paid jobs and interesting jobs as well. So they are saying, where is it? Yeah, so they need us to be able to analyze use cases and use stories, business requirement, and design documents. So we are going to cover these aspects, and I hope this can be helpful for you when you are in the job market, working in the industry. Okay, so let's start with the introduction. So what is requirement, and how we get it requirements? Okay, so let's get started. So let's consider a couple of scenarios. So for example, one a company like they software not software but general client, they want to have a software or they want to have a platform or website, and they may have a bid for a contract, like asking people to bid for that contract. So there must be something like sufficiently abstract way, like saying what we want, like what this software or this platform should be able to achieve. Okay, so this is a kind of requirement documentation. And when the different software companies are bidding for the contract, they may provide more details, like what we can do. Or after they have got the contract, like when the contract has been awarded, the contractor must write a more detailed system definition for the client, so that the client can understand and validate what the software will do. So this is also another kind of requirement documentations. So these are kind of scenarios or situations that we might need a requirement documentation, like what we need a requirements. Okay. So this is a kind of background, and we're also talking about functional or non-functional requirements and requirements engineering today. Okay, so before we code anything, we need to know how to test it, right? We talk a lot about this throughout the term, and we also practice in the projects. Okay, so before we code anything, we need to know how to design it. I also kind of emphasize about this point throughout a couple of lectures. Like, we need to know why we are doing what we are doing, right? So before we really sit down and start coding, we need to know how to design it and what we are designing for. Okay, so to test or design anything, we need to know what our objective is. So more specifically, what requirements of the system we are building on. So what are the requirements? So why? The objectives. Okay. Right. Okay, so when we are talking about requirements, there are two different types, like broadly or generally, there are two different general types of requirements, which are functional requirements or non-functional requirements. Okay, so functional requirements are basically what we normally say. For example, as a user, like a user should be able to search the appointment list for all. So given the software, for example, like there's a list of appointments for clinics, and functional requirements can be a user shall be able to search for the appointments in the software. So this is a kind of functional requirements. And non-functional requirements, talking about the constraints. For example, the system shall return the appointments in 5 seconds. An example. So kind of constraints on the performance or the security aspects. Okay, so functional requirements specify a specific capability or service that system should provide. So it's what the system does. Okay, so another example could be the system should generate a list of courses at UNSW. Okay, so this is what the system can do, what the system does. And non-functional requirements, so for example, the system should protect the security. So for example, what each student, like what courses each student has enrolled in. So this is kind of non-functional requirements. We can have a look at more examples. So here's more examples. So this one, like functional requirements, it can be like the system must send a notification to all users whenever there's a new post or someone comments on an existing post. So what the system does, right? And for non-functional requirements, is like the system must send emails no later than 30 minutes after from such an activity. Okay. And for this kind of requirement, this kind of example requirements, that we need to make sure that requirements are clear. Okay, so if a requirement is ambiguous, so if it's an ambiguous requirement, it might be interpreted in many different ways and may cause issues. For example, this one, the first example here. The system must send a notification to all users whenever there's activity or inputs on the platform. So it's kind of be ambiguous, like what is the activity? So what is the new inputs? So here we need to make sure, we need to try our best to make sure that it's clear, it's not ambiguous. Okay, but it's pretty hard actually in reality that, but we need to try. Okay, and yeah, so it's quite clear that functional requirements is what a system does again. But for non-functional requirements, there are many different types, types of non-functional requirements. So here in the example, we are seeing that no later than 30 minutes is kind of about the efficiency, about the performance requirements, but there are also other kinds of non-functional requirements. For example, here. So this is a quite good taxonomy or types of non-functional requirements. So we can have a look at those. So you can you may notice that this kind of requirements, talking about the system properties or constraints. So, for example, usability, performance, or security, or ethical requirements. So sometimes these kind of non-functional requirements can be more critical than functional requirements. So for example, if the software does not follow ethical requirements, it can be quite critical issue. Okay, and also sometimes non-functional requirements may affect the overall architecture of a system rather than an individual components. So for example, the users for functional requirements, like the user can search for courses. Okay, so it's kind of one component of a software system, right? But for non-functional requirement, it can be different. So for example, if we want the software system be more efficient, like for the efficiency requirement, the performance requirement, we might need to move the components a little bit to make sure there's less communication gaps. So it's kind of this kind of non-functional requirement sometimes can influence the overall structure of a software. Okay, so let's have a look at some of them and have a look at some examples. The product requirements. Okay, so we have seen the example about efficiency, right? Like get notification within 30 minutes, right? Sometimes we can also say like a system shall be available for use for the user to use during normal working hours. And if there's a downtime, it shall not exceed 5 seconds in any one day, right? So this is also a kind of non-functional requirement. Okay, and for organizational requirements, these are requirements. They are a consequence of organizational policies or procedures. So for example, in a specific organization, there might be some standard that we may need to follow when we having a new software for that organization, right? For example, if we have a software for healthcare or for health clinic, okay, or for patient management system, so we might need to follow this kind of organizational. So for example, in a university, right? So we have ZID, right? So with our ZID, we can log into Give or Teams. Okay, so this is also a kind of organizational requirements. We may also have external requirements, for example, ethics, okay, as we mentioned, and also about safety or security requirements. So for example, the system shall implement patient privacy standard, right? So this is a kind of external non-functional requirement. Okay, sometimes we may also have other types of requirements. So for example, a domain requirement for a specific domain, right? For example, what kind of example? Domain requirements. For Jiang, perhaps. So there may be specific requirements for Jiang, perhaps. I'm not sure. Okay, so this is functional and non-functional requirements. Okay, so how can we get those functional or non-functional requirements? Where do we get these requirements? Right. So requirement doesn't just appear out of thin air, right? We have to derive them, and to do that, we apply a process called requirement engineering. So it has a couple of processes to get the requirements. Okay, so now we listed a couple like elicitation, analysis, specification, and validation. So here are some general process in requirement engineering, and they are quite typical process, but sometimes we may have others. So, for example, we may have requirement management, and we may also have different names for them. So, for example, the first one, sometimes we also call it requirement discovery, but they are basically talking about very similar process. Okay, let's have a look. So here's a kind of a definition of requirement engineering. So requirement engineering is a set of activities focusing on identifying the purpose and the goal of a software system. Okay, so how is it like what kind of activities, right? So mainly that this kind of requirements coming from people, right? So coming from stakeholders. So a negotiation process where stakeholders agree on what they want, right? So, for example, we may have the end users who will be using our software. So they may, when we talk with the end users, they may provide us some requirements, right? So we may also have clients, like if we are a software company and we are developing a software for our clients, so they may also have some requirements. Okay, and also we have some design teams. Okay, so it's quite important to identify the important stakeholders when we are trying to get the requirements because we need to talk with them, right? So let's have another example. Right. So, for example, we have patient management system. Like let's try to use the same example, like a patient management system. So, what kind of stakeholders do you think we need to consider? Like who we need to talk with to get those requirements? For those who are online, you can put in the chat like who do you think can be stakeholders? Users. Yes, yes. So we might need to be a little more um, specific, like who are the users, like who will be using this kind of patient management system. So by patient managed system, we are talking about like, for example, a system that a clinic can use who have booked consultant with any doctor in any clinics. So we are and what kind of consultation it is, what is the like when is the next appointment. So yeah, thinking about this kind of patient managed system, who can be the user? Who are the users? Doctors, yes, yes, doctors who are responsible for treating the patients, right? The doctors will be using the system. So who else will be stakeholders? So what about nurses? Like who coordinate the consultation with the doctor and administer like the patient and also um, have some treatment for the patient. Like the nurses will also be kind of user, a stakeholder, right? Yeah. And in addition to the users being one kind of stakeholders, actually there are more stakeholders. Yeah, the company managing the system. Yes, that's right. That's it. Where exactly right. So the IT staff or the managers who manage the system. Yes, yes, exactly. And we may also have a medical ethics manager, right, who manage the ethical requirements, right? So they are also kind of stakeholder in this kind of system, right? And we may also have some IT staff, right? So we have IT staff who are responsible for installing or maintaining the system, right? So they are also part of the stakeholders, right? So as you may have noticed that stakeholders can be quite broad. It's not only limited to our end users, right? And when we are trying to generate those requirements or find those requirements, we need to talk with them. So they are all using the system or interacting with the system in some way. Okay, so after we identify the stakeholders, often we follow a logical process across these 4 steps. So the first step is to elicitation of raw requirements from stakeholders. So we talk with them and we got those raw requirements. Okay, so after we got those raw requirements, okay, so we may need to analyze those requirements. Okay. And by analyzing the requirements, we mean that we may group similar requirements together, or we may find some important requirements when we are talking with them. Okay, and the third step is formal specification of the requirements. So we may get a long list of requirements. So we cannot do all of them all at once. So we might need to prioritize them, right? And there might be some conflicts in different requirements. So how can we resolve those conflicts? So this is in step 3. And the last step here is validation of the requirements. So we might need to, before we really get down to coding, we need to validate those requirements and make sure that these are really required. Okay. We got a question in the chat. So everyone who touches or uses the app, or are patients also stakeholders? Okay, this is a very good question. So the question is whether patients are also stakeholders in our example, like we mentioned about the patient management system. Yes, patients are also stakeholders because although they are not directly using the system, but they are kind of affected by the system, right? So they are also stakeholders. So they may have some privacy concerns when there's such a patient management system. So they are also stakeholders. That's a very good question. Okay, so let's move on with these 4 steps. Okay, so let's get started with the first one, which is elicitation. So we also call it requirement discovery. So when you say, when you find somewhere talking about requirement discovery, it's the same. Okay, so requirement discovery is the process of gathering information about the required and existing system. Okay, and we distill the user and system requirement from this information. And how we got this information? So how do we discover those requirements? So we do. So discovery requirement is it's very important. First of all, then it's a little bit complex than what we've seen here. So there's a job title called user research, or somebody working on user experience design. They may work with some of these requirement discovery. So what they do is they do market research. So for example, during the lockdown, during the COVID pandemic, so myself and some of my friends were trying to develop a software for workout. Like we can't go to gyms, right? So what we are trying to do is to help people work out at home and with some guidance from a coach. Right? So before we try to develop this software, we need to understand the user requirements. So what we did first is do some market research, right? So what people are currently doing. So how are they working out from home and with support with guidance, right? So we need to do some market research. What kind of software is already there in the market, right? And what the market is asking for, right? So then we need to have some interviews with the stakeholders. So this is what we have been talking about, like talking with the stakeholders. And interviews is kind of more formal, but we may also have informal interviews. But the key here is that we ask them questions, right? So we hands up and we ask them questions. Okay, so let's do another activity here. So for example, you are trying to develop software for people to work out from home and with guidance. And you are going to talk with stakeholders and have interviews with them. Okay, so who are the stakeholders? Who you will be talking to, and what are you going to talk about? Okay. So for example, here we may have some interviews with people who are currently working out from home, doing some exercise at home, and they may watch some YouTube videos, right? We may also talk with gym coach. So they used to coach people in gyms. So now how are they the employees and the company? We gotta answer in the chat, like the employees and company. Who are the employees and which company? So when we talk about stakeholders, we need to be a little bit more specific. Okay. Right. Yeah, so for example, when we talk with people who work out from home, like we may ask them some questions such as, okay, so first of all, one type of question that we cannot ask, which is, what feature would you like to have if there's a software can do this? Okay, or we cannot ask them, do you need a software that can help you work out from home? Right. It's not we can't ask, but what I'm trying to say is that it's not very effective, right? So what we are trying to really ask them to get some informative information is that we need to ask them questions like how are you working out from home right now, like, or this week or this month, right? So we need to know their experience, and we may also ask them questions like, do you have any concerns working out from home? Like you may have injured yourself if you are not doing things properly, right? You may hurt your knees or something, right? So this is how we talk with the stakeholders. Okay, and for interviews, we may have a structured interview or very open-ended interview. So we may just have a chat, like very open-ended chat. But most often we have kind of a structure. So we predefine some questions that we ask, right? So we have a kind of a structure that we ask them the specific questions, and if they give us an answer, we ask follow-on questions. Ask them to explain further and ask about their experience, ask about if there's any challenge they have faced. Okay, so one question in the chat. So general questions, not specific. I would not say so. So in interviews, normally we ask both type of questions. So we do ask general questions, like most often we start with general questions. So for example, how are you currently working out? Okay, and then when they give us some answers, for example, they say like, I follow YouTube guideline and I do some workouts. Okay, and then we ask some more specific question relating to what they have said. Like for example, which YouTube video you follow? Do you follow specific video, or how is that YouTube video? what kind of guidance do you get from that YouTube video? So we ask both general and specific question. Okay, so this is interviews. And the next one is focus group. So focus group meaning that we are not only talking with one or two stakeholders at once, like we put people together. So for example, in one focus group, we may put the coach and who do some workout at home together, or a couple of coaches, a couple of individuals together, and we do a focus group. Like for example, if there's a platform, like how are you going to interact with this kind of platform? So this is focus group. Okay, but we in focus group we also ask questions. The questions can be in like we also ask what if and what is and how. Okay. In the chat we got the question is in interviews, so we ask general questions, then specific. So this is not always the case. It really depends. Okay, so designing interview questions also take a lot of effort. Okay, so you need to understand. So again, you need to understand the objective. So what do you want to get from an interview, and then you design the interview questions. It's not like just a set of like it's not like we always start with general questions and then specific. Okay, sometimes we also start with specific. It really depends on the context. Okay, just to clarify. Okay, then after we have collect a bunch of interview data, okay, let's go back a little bit here. So one thing I might add here, right? So in addition to market research, interviews, and focus groups, sometimes we also have surveys. Okay, so sometimes we want to reach a very diverse set of stakeholders. So for example, our users may come from different cultural background, different age background, different ages, or may come from different geography locations in a country or even globally. Okay, sometimes we might want to reach a large audience. In that cases, we might want to do some surveys instead of this kind of interviews. So interviews takes time, right? Although we can get some in-depth information from those interviews, but it also has some limitations. So this is why sometimes we also do some surveys, right? Some online surveys. And you can just post a link to the survey in your Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn, and you can get more diverse information from the surveys. And you can also get some quantitative information from surveys. Okay. For interviews, we mainly get qualitative inputs, but for surveys, we can also get some quantitative information, like how many people agree that they are facing this challenge, or how many people at this specific country are facing this specific challenge, so that we can get some this kind of quantitative information or quantitative data. Okay, so after we got all this data, the interview data or survey data or market research data or focus group data, so what is the next step? Okay, so the next step is we need to analyze them. Okay, so there are some like ways or tools that we can analyze the data, but the purpose, the aim here is that we are trying to group information. Like for example, in 10 interviews, we have 5 stakeholders raised one specific issue. Okay, then we group those kind of themes. So we call it themes. So we group those problems together as a theme. Okay, so we kind of categorize the information we get from the requirement discovery process. Okay, another important thing in this analysis step is that we prioritize things. Okay, so after we get a lot of requirements, we need to prioritize. So we might prioritize the requirements based on how many people agree with that, like how many stakeholders want to have that problem solved. Okay, but we may also prioritize based on like if we want to solve this problem, how long will it take, right? So the cost and what kind of resources we have currently in our company. So this all contribute to like the analysis process, like how we prioritize those requirements. There are also some other tools or ways that can help with the analysis process that we'll be talk about them today. Okay, both of them. I'll try to cover both of them today. Okay. For priorities, we may also use our quantitative data from our surveys, right? So if we have a lot of quantitative data, it can also help with prioritize the requirements, right? Okay. The next step is called specification. So specification is mainly about documenting things. So after we got a lot of requirements and we analyze them, we prioritize them, then we need to write them down. And we also need to make sure they are written down in a way that is clear and easy to understand for our stakeholders and our development team. So for example, here's an example, like try to granulate this paragraph. So it says that the system shall keep the door locked at all times unless instructed otherwise by an authorized user. When the lock is disarmed, the countdown shall be initiated at the end of which the lock shall be automatically armed if still disalarmed. So this is not easy to understand, right? So it's kind of hard to understand. So this is something that we try to not have. Okay, so we try to have very condensed, very specific and clear specifications. And the last step is called validation. Okay, so it's different from the testing. Like when we talk about correctness in this course, it's different. So it's for validation is that we are trying to check you haven't gotten lost. So after we do all the 3 steps above, requirement discovery, analysis, and specification, we go back to the stakeholders and ensuring the requirements are correct. And so we'll explain more about validation later. So we may notice that it is important to make sure that we understand those requirements. However, it's sometimes quite challenging. It has a couple of challenges. So for example, this first one, requirements sometimes only understood after design or build has begun. This is quite common actually. So understanding the requirement is not, in many cases, does not happen suddenly. So it's kind of a gradual process. So after we start to design, start to build, and the stakeholders may have some feedback into our design or build, and then we understand the requirements better. So this is why we often have a lot of iterations in our agile practices, right? And the second one is clients and customers sometimes don't know what they want. This is true. So this is also why in our interviews, we try not to ask questions like, what do you want? Okay, so because they often do not know what they want. So what we are trying to ask them is how they are currently experiencing things, and we try to identify what can help them solve the issue they currently have. Okay, so they often do not know what they want. So this is True. Okay, and the third one is clients or customers sometimes change their mind. Okay, so changing requirement is also normal. It's also common, especially in current world. Like technologies are evolving very, very fast. A lot of new things are happening every day. Okay, so change their mind, or maybe not because they change their mind, but just changing requirements. So, okay, so for example, there's some new hardware maybe introduced, or there's some new technologies available, and the clients or customers want to have some more advanced features or have something different, so they may change. Okay, and business priorities may also change, like the priorities in the business. Okay, and there may also be some new regulations. Then we also need to change it, right? So there are many different reasons for changing our requirements. Okay, and there are many, perhaps also others. For example, um, people who pay for this software, like who want to have this software, so who invest in developing this software. It's not the real users who are eventually will be using this software. Okay, so we may also change the requirements later. Okay, the next one is developers might not understand the subject domain. Okay, yes, this is also very, very true. So for example, the patient management system that we use that example. So there might be some domain constraints. So for example, the ethics for patient management system, the ethics requirements for that specific domain. Okay, so our developers do not understand that domain, right? So this is why we try to get different stakeholders get involved in this requirement engineering process. Limited access to stakeholders. This is also true. Like we are, for example, we may try our best to do a lot of interviews, to do a lot of surveys or focus groups. However, we cannot get access to those people. So, for example, we want to have a software for people with some disabilities, for example, and it's not very easy to get access to those, not how to phrase it. So we might not get sufficient participants for our interviews. Okay. Or the participants may in other countries for specific software. Okay, so may have limited access to the stakeholders. And the last challenge is jumping into details or solutions too early. This is a very common mistake, like us software engineers make. Like we want to jump to the solutions. Like we think, okay, I can help you solve this problem. Like I already have a solution. Okay, and then I sit down and start working on the solution. Um, this is not a good practice. We need to make sure we have a well discovered and validated requirements, so that we can be clear like what is the scope, what the users really want, and how are they going to really interact with that system, that software. Okay, so these are the challenges. Okay. Yeah, I can see in the chat. Okay, cool. Right. Okay, so I just want to emphasize the importance of uh, requirement engineering. So, so the last one, the XY problem. Let's have a look. Yeah, so you may notice that there are a lot of discussions on the XY problem. But the key here is that we should not jump to the detailed solution too early. We are trying to be open-ended, be creative at the beginning. Okay, so we need to make sure that we really understand the requirements. And when we talk about the user stories or user cases later in the second lecture today, we are also seeing that we try to be open-ended at the beginning. Not open-ended, but not go to too much details or solutions at the very beginning. Okay, and I got a question like, what if a requirement change? Okay, so this is common, like a requirement change. So how should we decide if a requirement change, if we can accept a requirement change? So this really depends. So for example, if this is important, so for example, the regulation changed. So for example, the privacy regulation changed for the patient management system. We definitely need to update our software. We need to accept that requirement change, right? But sometimes there's a new need raised from the users, like the stakeholders. We might need to identify whether it is important, whether this new need is needed by a lot of users, or this is only needed by a small group of users. Okay, so we need to do some problem analysis. Okay, and also we might need to estimate like how much cost they may need, like cost of money, cost of resources, cost of time, like whether it worth it. So kind of coming back to the stage here, the analysis. So when there's some kind of new requirements coming in or requirement change, we kind of go back to this process. We analyze the requirements and prioritize things. Okay, and when we decide like we want to accept that change, we want to implement that change, it's also quite important that we document things. So we have requirement documents, and we need to update that. Sometimes we may also update our system, so we may also document what we update, right? So this is like what we should do when the requirement change. Okay, and you may also ask another question like, we are now in an agile world, right? So requirement engineering was, so this topic was defined like when we are following the waterfall model, like we mentioned last week. We start with a requirement, right, and design, and then, so this is quite typical in waterfall model, but now we are in an agile world, right? So what should we do about requirement engineering? Okay, so agile requirements, sometimes we call it agile requirements. Okay, so it's very important, like we have a shared understanding of those customers' needs. And this shared understanding is shared between our developers and the product owner, and also designer for the system. So it's kind of a shared understanding of the requirement and the user's need, the stakeholders' need. Okay, and in an agile world, we start with focusing on high-level requirement, and then we leave the implementation details to the development teams because they have the shared understanding, right? And how they get this kind of shared understanding in an agile world. So for example, when we talk about conducting interviews, the market research. So to have this kind of shared understanding, you may try to have one member of the design or one member of the development team involved in this kind of customer interviews, so that they can hear directly from what the customers say, what the stakeholders say. Okay, so they are not only getting the information from the documents passing on from the design team, passing on from the product owner, but they are hearing the conversation directly. Okay. Um, yeah, and another thing in the agile world about requirement engineering is keep open. Like things are always changing, right? Um, yeah. So these are like how requirement engineering um, works in agile. Okay. Um, we are also talking more about understanding requirements in agile in the second lecture. Okay, so let's have a quick break for 10 minutes. Let's get started again in 11. Okay, and we'll be talking about use cases and user stories. Okay, welcome back. Um, so we've talked about what is requirement and how is the requirement engineering process. Um, Now let's talk a little bit more about user stories and user cases, use cases. Okay, so we have already seen in the linking job ads that a lot of the job ads, like they ask about uh, knowledge on user stories and use cases. So why is this important? Okay, so why do we need to know user stories and use cases? So this is especially important, especially uh, in Agile, like in an Agile team or after the Agile movement. So before that, we kind of, so what is a user story? So let's get started with what is user stories first. So user stories are a method of requirement engineering used to inform the development process and what features to build with the user at the center. Okay, so kind of emphasize the user at the center. So this is also an important part of Agile, right? So in Agile, we emphasize like we need to put user at the center. We need to make sure that users are involved in the whole development process. Right. So before Agile, we kind of um, after the client or the customer came to us like, I want to build this or that, and our development team start to build the software straightforward, straight away. And this often has the problem that when we finish developing everything and we think we know what the user's needs are, and then we end up delivering software that they didn't want. So it's kind of waste of time, money, and a lot of things. So and not good result as well. Okay, so in Agile, we are emphasizing that we put a user at the center. So you may also heard a lot about like user-centered development or user-centered design or user-centered AI model, user-centered everything. So we kind of put a user at the center. And user story kind of help with putting the user at the center. Okay, so it's important, very useful tool of Agile. Okay, so as we can see here, like so let's have a look how user story looks like. Okay, so when a customer tells you what they want and try to express it, we try to express it in the format as a type of user. I want to achieve some goal so that for some reason. Okay, so for example here, as a student, I want to purchase a parking pass so that I can drive to school. So you can notice that we put the student, the user, in the center of the user story, right? So you may also notice that this is different from the requirements. So when we talk about requirements in the previous lecture, we say like requirements is typically a list of the system shall do this or the system shall do that. So for example, the system shall allow a company to pay for it, or a system shall allow a student to purchase a parking pass, right? But in the user story, put a student, the user in the center, like as a student, I want to purchase a parking pass so that the reason is that I want to drive to school. Okay, so this is the structure of user stories. It's very simple, very short, do not have very long sentences, no long paragraphs. So it's very, very straightforward. A user story is actually an informal or general explanation of a software feature, and it's written from the perspective of the end user or the customer. Okay, other examples may include, for example, as a traveler, I want to check in so that I can fly to another country or fly to another city, right? Or as a user for Teams, like I can log in so that I can meet, have online meetings, right? So this is how user stories look like. And the purpose of a user story, okay. So the purpose of a user story is to, so the purpose of user story is to communicate the user's need with the customers and with other stakeholders and with the development team. Okay, so that one development team working on a user story, they kind of know clearly why they are working on that piece of program or that piece of code or that feature. Okay, so there are a couple of attributes of user stories. So first of all, user stories are written in non-technical language. So you can see in this example, it's absolutely non-technical language, right? And the reason for that is we need to communicate user stories with our stakeholders, and many of them do not understand much about the technical stuff. So if we put a lot of technical stuff in our user stories, it's very hard to communicate with the stakeholders, right? So the second one is that user stories are focused on keeping the customer at the core of experience. Yeah, so we have been talking a lot about this, right? So yeah, we need to put the user at the center. Okay, and the next one is user goal focused, not product feature focused. Okay, so user stories are describe problem, not solution. So this is also very important that we don't put solutions in our user stories. We only put what the users want to achieve with our software in the user stories. Right? We didn't say something like, as a student, I want to put in like what kind of technical stuff? Token? I don't know. But there's no technical stuff. There's no solution in it. So it's very user goal focused. Okay. And it's written in stories, right? So it's like the format of it is like a story. So the reason that we use the format, use the stories is that stories can enable collaboration, right? So a team with developers and the stakeholders, when they are given a story, they can brainstorm solutions, and they can understand the user's need more clearly with this kind of story, right? Yeah, and they never go into details. And when we already have user stories, so after we have user stories, we may start work on the requirements. So with more details in it, like more details on what the system should do. But before we go into the details, we talk with the users, the stakeholders, and we generate these kind of user stories. Okay, so now let's have an activity. So let's have some user stories for a to-do list. Okay, so what kind of user stories we may have? As a user, I want to log in with my ZID so that I can view all the items of my to-do list. As a as an admin for a to-do list, I want to organize all the to-do list. Okay, or as a user, I want to prioritize my to-do items so that I can know which one I should start with, which I should focus on. Okay. We got in the chat, user student wants to keep track of assessments for the term. Great. So we might need to put in the structure, the format of user stories, which is as a student, perhaps in your example, like user student wants to keep track of assessments for the term. So we may write in the form as a student, I want to keep track of assessment for the term so that I can finish everything on time, perhaps. Okay, so this is the format of user story. We need to format our story in this format. Okay, so we may also have other examples. For instance, we may have a forum. So what kind of user stories we may have for a forum? Yeah. All right. So what kind of user stories for a forum? Thinking about forum as a staff for a course. I want to answer questions. I want to tag a post as complete or incomplete. Okay, so that I can know what else I need to do, right? So other user stories. You can think of a lot. But where is the user stories coming from? It's not coming from our developers, or not only coming from developers, it's from our stakeholders, our end users, right? So we need to keep that in mind. Yes, we have in the chat, like as a student, I want to ask questions. Exactly. That's right. So that's the correct format. Okay. Yep, so there are some good properties of user stories. Before we go into the details, you may notice it's INVEST, it's invest. Okay, so sometimes we can say like good properties of user stories, invest. Okay, but let's have a look at them one by one here. So the first one is independent. Meaning that each user story is independent from the other user stories. Okay, so the reason is that in agile environment, like when we are having one sprint, we may pick one user story and finish implementing or developing that user story in one sprint. So we can pick from the user stories and prioritize them. Okay, so we need to make sure that a good user story is independent from other user stories. Okay, so that we can finish one user stories in 1 or 2 sprints. Okay, and the second one is negotiable. Avoid too much details, right? So you can notice this in the format, right? It's very, very general. We try to avoid too much detail because we want to be creative when we try to solve the problem. Okay, and we do not put any solution in our user stories, right? Okay, valuable, the next one, which is valuable, must hold some value to the client. Yes, we have in the form like as a user, I want to do something because I want to achieve this or that. So must hold some value to the client, right? So it's valuable. And estimatable. So we'll get into this in a later lecture. Okay, so it's small, right? So it needs to be able to finish in 1 or 2 sprints. It's a small chunk of work, and it is testable. Okay, so we need to make sure after we develop that feature or implement that user story, we need to know that we have done it and we have done it successfully. So it's testable. Okay, if you want to learn more, here's the link. So how can we test a user story, like whether it's achieved successfully or not. Okay, so we have this user acceptance criteria. Okay, so let's think of one example. For instance, I have a user story that as a user, I can search for a book using a search bar in an online bookstore. So there's an online bookstore, okay, and as a user, I want to search for a book from the online bookstore so that I can find the book that I want. Okay, so this is my user story. So what do you think the development team will have for my user story? So perhaps they will develop something like there's a search bar on top of my interface, like the front page. And then there's a search bar there, and I put something in there and I click on search. Okay, and I get a list of books having the keyword. Okay, perhaps this is it. Okay, perhaps I may also get something like there's a search bar. Okay, I put some keyword there, and there's another drop down list that I can search for. Select from categories, select different categories, and then I search from this bookstore. Okay, perhaps I'm expecting the second one. So perhaps as a product owner, I'm expecting to have the user search from a list of categories in this online bookstore. Okay, so we might need to have a method to help us test whether user story has been satisfied or not. Okay, so this is why we need to have this kind of user acceptance criteria. So specific criteria. So we break down the user story into a criteria that must be met for the user or customer to accept. So with the user acceptance criteria, there's more details. Right, so we need to specify, we need to have this, we need to do that, and then this user story is done. Okay, so this is definitely need to be. So we need to have this user acceptance criteria before implementation, and it is written in natural language. Okay, so while the user stories aims at describing what exactly the user wants the system to do, all right, so very high level general things like what the user wants system to do, and the goal of the acceptance criteria is to explain the conditions at a specific that a specific user story must satisfy. Okay. So let's have a look at one example. As a user, so this is a user story, okay? So this is a user story. Like as a user, I want to use a search field to type a city name or a street so that I can find matching hotel options. Okay, so this is the user story. So below is a list of user acceptance criteria. Okay, the search field is placed on the top bar. Yes, otherwise, we may put the search bar at the bottom on the left-hand side or right-hand side. So it kind of specify where the search field should be at. Okay, and the second one is search starts once the user clicks search, right? Okay, so there's a button called search, and search starts when the user clicks on this button called search. And the third one is the field contains a placeholder with a gray color text, where are you going? Right, so this kind of information is not in our user stories, but the user acceptance criteria provide more details, like including the color and what exactly is the text. And the next one is the placeholder disappears when the user starts typing. Search is performed if a user types in a city, hotel name, street, all combined. And the last one is the user can't type more than 200 symbols. So this is very specific, and this example, so this user acceptance criteria is for the user interface, right? So all of these are about the user interface, but there may be also other user acceptance criteria for it. But this example is for the user interface, right? And if we do not have this kind of details, we may think, is it the search in a notepad, like in iPad, or is it on a laptop, or is it in the Linux context? For example, we used search in VI, right, in the command line, like in Linux, right? But given this kind of detailed user acceptance criteria, we kind of, it's more clear, like what our development team should do, what we should do to finish this user story. Okay, other examples here. As a user, I can log in through a social media account because I always forget my password. Okay. Yeah. So user acceptance criteria for this user story can be like, can log in through Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, right? Here are some criteria, some key points of user acceptance criteria. For the first one, the acceptance criteria should not be too broad, nor should they be too narrow. The reason that it cannot be too broad is because if it is too broad, it's very hard for the development team to understand the scope. Right? So if it's too broad, the development team can do a lot of things. Right? It's hard to define the scope if it's too broad, but it also cannot be too narrow, so that the development team will have everything has been defined, and they cannot have any creative solution or anything is hard. Yeah, and the next one is minimize technical details. So this is the same as when we're talking about user stories. We try to minimize any technical details. We also need to make sure that the client needs to understand them, right? So we need to understand that user acceptance criteria needs to be defined before any implementation. Right. And this user acceptance criteria, we also need to communicate with our client, make sure that they agree on this criteria before any implementation, so that we need to make sure that clients need to understand our user acceptance criteria. While they can be updated during development, they should first be written before, yes, should this user acceptance criteria needs to exist before implementation. Right? And acceptance tests are tests that are performed to ensure acceptance criteria have been met, right? And not all acceptance criteria can easily be mapped to automated acceptance tests. And sometimes you need to set up user acceptance testing environment for real users to manually use it and provide feedback. This is very common. To have real users to manually use it and provide feedback. And this is something that we are always doing when we have a first version of our software, and we have some real users to use it and provide feedback to help us test the software and give some feedback. And acceptance tests are black box tests, of course. The example we have seen here. So in this example and this example, they are called rule-oriented acceptance criteria format. Okay, so for user acceptance criteria, there are multiple different types of format. And this format is called rule-oriented format. And this rule-oriented format entails that there is a set of rules that describe the behavior of a system. So it's kind of setting up a set of rules. Okay, so this is one type of format, but there's also another format called scenario-oriented. Okay, so for scenario-oriented user acceptance criteria format, we are writing like a story. Okay, so it's in this format, like given some preconditions, when I do some actions, then I expect some result. So this is the overall structure, the overall format. Sometimes we have some additional things. So for example, given some preconditions, when I do some action and I do some action, then I expect some result. So I add an and in between when and then. I may also have something like, given some precondition, when I do some action, then I expect some result. And then I expect some result. And then I expect some result. So we can add and for any of these three parts. I can also add and for given, which is the same. It's used to continue any of these three previous conditions using and. Here's an example. This is a user story. As a user, I want to be able to recover the password to my account so that I will be able to access my account in case I forgot the password. Okay, so we always forget our password. The user acceptance criteria here is in this scenario-oriented format, we give a name to this scenario, which is forgot password, and then we start the given, when, and then. Right? So given the user has navigated to the login page. When the user selected forgot password option and entered a valid email to receive a link for password recovery, then the system sent the link to the entered email. Given the user received the link via the email, when the user navigated through the link received in the email, then the system enables the user to set a new password. So this is in the scenario-oriented format. Okay, so we start with a name of this scenario. Okay, so it's the name for the behavior that will be described, and this behavior is called forgot password. Okay. And when describes the specific action that a user makes, so what triggers the following thing. And then it's the outcome. So then it's the outcome of when, and sometimes, so and is continuing this when, right? So then it's the outcome of when. Clear? Is that clear? Okay, let's move on. So now we have rule-based acceptance criteria and also scenario-based acceptance criteria. So which one should we use? Again, there's no single answer to it. for scenario-based acceptance criteria, it's easier to implement tests. Okay, so you can see that we have like given when and then. So we kind of given what is the input and then what is the expected output. So it's kind of easier to implement tests if we are using scenario-based acceptance framework. Okay, but rule-based acceptance criteria, they are simpler and generally work for all sorts of stories. Not all sorts of stories can have scenario-based acceptance framework, but rule-based acceptance criteria works for most user stories. So it really depends. There's no single answer like which one should we use. Yeah, but the rule-based looks more straightforward, right? The rule-based one. So it's just a list of bullet points, right? So it looks easier, but sometimes it's not that straightforward to have the tests. Okay. So now we have already talked about user stories and user like acceptance criteria. So now let's move on to use cases. So by definition, like when you okay, let's have a look at this part. So use cases represent a dialogue between the user and the system, with the aim of helping the user achieve a business goal. And the user initiates the actions and the system responds with reactions. So it's very, very similar when you read some text like this. So it's very similar to user stories, right? So it's also user-centered. It talks about what a user can do with the system. However, they are not the same. But they are both of them are used in gathering requirements from customers in software engineering, right? But they are different. So let's have a look. What's the difference and what is use case? Okay. Again here, so they consider system as a black box and are only focused on high-level understanding of the flow. Okay. For use cases, we can have a list of steps like it's written, but we can also have visual like diagrams of use cases. Okay, so here's a template. So this is how use cases looks like. Okay. So here's the template for providing some background. So we may have more details for the use cases, right? So before we provide a list of the use cases, we may have a use case background. So for example, what is the name? Okay, and what is the goal? What is the scope? What are the preconditions? And what is the success end condition? What is the failed end condition? Who are the primary actor? And what is the trigger? So you can see that with use cases, there are a lot more details, a lot of information in use cases. So use cases is a more detailed description of a set of interactions between the system. And for use cases, we may also have more actors get involved. But for user stories, each user story only has one actor involved. Okay. So here's one example. When we use diagrams to illustrate use cases. Okay, so this is when someone wants to withdraw some cash from ATM. And ATM will first ask the user to enter your PIN. Okay, type in the PIN number, verify account, and XYZ validated balance, and how many I can help you. So how much do you want to withdraw? Withdraw 60. Okay, please take your cash, collecting cash, and the ATM will also inform the bank. So this is the bank, like they withdraw 60, and the bank acknowledged. Okay. So this is use cases. You may see that they're kind of describing the interactions, right? It's different from user stories, right? It describes some interactions, and there are more actors involved. So here we have the people who want to withdraw some money. Okay, we also have the ATM. We also have the bank. Right? So there are more actors involved in this process. So this is when we illustrate use case with diagrams, but we also have written down list of use case. Okay, so we can also provide a use case in a written form. So the first step is ATM asks the customers for PIN, and then the customers enters PIN, and then the ATM asks the banks to verify the PIN account. So it's different way of formatting the use case. Okay, so this happens after we have provide this background. Right. So for use cases, we also need to provide some background information for it. Okay. Sure. Cool. So so you can see that use cases have a lot more details, and use cases are more about behavior that the technical team will have to build into the software. So a lot of behavior here, and a lot of interactions. It contains a lot of details, clearly describing everything that a developer needs to build, so that it can meet the user's need. Okay. Okay, so let's have a look at example of this template providing background, right? So let's have a look at one example for this so that you can, because there's no example in this slide. Okay, so let me get you an example. Okay, so here is it. So here's one example. So this is one example of the template. So for different use cases, we may have different fields. So this is like what field you include in your use cases is really depends. Again, depends, right? In the template we have in this slide, we have use case, goals, scope, preconditions. But in this example, we may have, so for example, the name, again, the name of the use case, right? We also have a summary of what this use case is talking about. So here it says that all occurrences of a search term are replaced with replacement tag. So what this, so a summary of this use case, right? So they are trying to search for a keyword, search for a word, and replace that word with a replacement tag. And they also provide some rationale, like why. Okay, so why do we have these use cases, right? So it's like similar to the one we have in the slide, like go in the contact. Okay. And who are the users? Like who are the actors involved? In the example, like the user withdraw money from ATM, the users involve the people who withdraw the money and the ATM and the bank, right? And here we just generate our users. We may also have some preconditions. For example, if we want to search a term and replace, we need to have precondition that a document is already loaded and is being edited. Right. So here we also have basic course of the events, the list of the use cases. For example, the user put in a PIN, and then the next step is the ATM, verify the PIN and the username with the bank, right? But here is that the user indicates that the software is to perform a search and replacing document. The software responds by requesting the search term and the replacement task. So they kind of put the list of the use case in this document. So it's optional. So you can of course put it here, but you can also put it separately. Right. Here, interestingly, in addition to the basic course of event, so the basic use cases, they also have alternative paths, right? So if something is not happening as what we expected in any of these interactions, what should happen? Right? So for example, here in step 3, which is here, like the user inputs the search term and replacement task and indicates that all occurrences are to be replaced. Okay, but here, what if the user indicates that only the first occurrence is to be replaced? So what would happen? Right. So for the format, as long as we are being consistent, we include the most important information. That is fine. So you may have additional fields here. You may also have less fields here. So for example, we do not have any alternative path here, as in the ATM example. That's also fine. Okay, but yep. Okay. What else? Okay, so here we also have another interesting use case methodology that I want to share with you. So this is a step for generating use cases. Okay. Again, this is not a standard way, but it's used for you to generate use cases. Okay, so the first one is identify all system users and create a profile for each one. So meaning that identify all the stakeholders as we have seen when we talk about user stories. Select one user and define their goal. So we start with one user and what is their goal. So as we have seen here, right, what is the goal? Okay, and we describe the course taken through the system to reach that goal as what we have seen here, right? Not this one, but the example here, right? In this example, right? What are the courses, the basic courses of the event? So we need to identify them. Okay, and we consider every alternate course of event and extend the use case, like what we have seen the example. So what if the user only wants to search for the very first occurrence of that text, right? And the next step is that identify our like in the user journey, create a common course use case, and then we repeat. So again, this kind of iteration in this process. Okay. I also found a quite useful table that comparing the features between use cases and user stories. Let me share with you. Okay, so where's the link to it? Okay, let's just have a look at here. So here's a quick comparison of features between a use case and a user story. Right. So use case, first of all, has a lot of details, right? And it documents the interactions between the system and the actor. Um, but for user stories, a lot shorter. Okay. Less details in a user story, very high level, what the users want to achieve. For use cases, it has like more information, like what is the goal, what are the preconditions, the flow steps, alternatives. Okay. But for user story, the format is like, as a user, I want to do something so that I can get expected outcome. Okay. For use cases, it's often used by developers to develop features based on the descriptions given because it has a lot of useful details in it. But for user stories, it covers a single scenario, and it's like for one specific sprint, like development team want to develop implement that user story for that specific sprint. Okay. But both of them can be used to communicate with our stakeholders, get some feedback from them, and needs to be done before the implementation. And important here is that for use cases, it's often used in waterfall software development process, but it can also be adapted for agile. Okay. But for user stories, it's more often used in agile software development projects. Okay, because it's very clear, and sometimes we put some sticky notes on the whiteboard. One sticky note is one user story, and you can move things around and prioritize them, and it's easier for faster decision making. And feature implementation prioritization. Right. Okay, cool. So this is a comparison between use cases and user stories, but both of them are useful in software development lifecycle. It just depends on what do you need, what do you want to achieve. So objective again. Okay. So here's some more further reading if you are interested in. I think in project iterations rate, we are also have some components that we need to do some requirement engineering and have some use cases or user stories. So I hope this is useful for you. Otherwise, that's all for this lecture. We always value your feedback as always. I've noticed that a lot of groups have already kickstart iterations rate. That's great, that's perfect. If you haven't, please do so as soon as possible because for iterations rate we have only 2 weeks and a little bit more, and then we are moving on to iteration 4. Okay, make good use of the tutorial session, the lab session, and we also have a lot of help sessions. And if you have any other questions, you can put in the forum. Get some more very fast reply, hopefully. So make good use of our teaching team, and if you have any questions, please ask. Okay, otherwise, thank you so much for coming. We'll have an in-person lecture tomorrow in the theater. Okay, see ya. Enjoy the rest of the week and best luck with your project. Okay, see you. Thank you so much for coming.